Andrew, hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. I'm really good. I'm having a double Andrew day today because I'm meeting yourself today now and at the historian Andrew Smith later today to talk about wine and cheese. So I'm having a very Andrew-filled uh,
Wow,
Andrew-filled day. Um,
good to me.
we're starting our films off by asking contributors just to introduce themselves and to give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Andrew Power, published as Andrew J. Power, and the J must be important somehow. I'm not sure. Not sure how. Um, and I am an assistant professor of Shakespeare in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Sharjah, which is in the United Arab Emirates. Um, my work is in several discrete pockets. Um, I guess the one that has sort of taken over has been on theatre history and specifically on actors who performed in Shakespeare's plays.
Hmm.
So that work expresses itself in work for the New Oxford Shakespeare that came out in 2017. On that, I did casting charts and doubling lists and stage properties lists for all of the plays in that fantastic new volume.
Hmm.
And I'm going to do a similar job for the Oxford Marlowe that is forthcoming.
So just to unpack that for audiences who'll be new to that, you're providing lists of props, of objects used within the life of a play on stage, and also in a theatre culture, early modern theatre culture, where you've got a limited number of performers, it's possible for brilliant people like yourself to plot out where particular actors might have been in particular moments in the play, who they would have been playing.
Not looking for exact actors by name, but rather looking for um, really how many actors are needed to do all of the parts of the plays. And then the doubling lists offer potential doubling up of roles. So where one actor might be available in a scene that his main character isn't in, or another character that he's playing isn't in order to take that role as well. So one actor can take two or maybe three roles. And just looking at the possibilities there, never sort of asserting definitively that we must pair, for instance, Cordelia with the Fool, which is, I think, a very popular one, but one that actually looks impractical to me. But looking at possibilities
Yeah.
where we might double.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm always mindful that some of the people watching these videos will be very new to these ideas. So I'm trying to think of kind of modern equivalents of doubling. And often it feels like quite a specifically theatrical thing, but actually in films like The Social Network, you've got Armie Hammer playing those two terrible twins who think that they own Facebook, for example. And in There Will Be Blood as well, you have a similar issue where the same actor is playing two twin characters. So I guess it is something we see perhaps more in modern culture, more than we think, but it's endemic. It's kind of built into how plays work in Shakespeare's time.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to ancient Greece, where we're wearing masks, and um, there are three actors, a tritagonist. The third actor is the sort of great invention of Sophocles, and yet there are many more parts. What they're doing there is just switching masks. I suppose our actors in the early modern stage are going to have to do a little more than switch masks. Um, but yeah, it's a process that, or a practice that goes back to ancient Greek culture and is used again in the early modern period. And modern theatre practitioners use it a lot. It's a matter of economy where you don't want to pay two actors or more.
Yeah, a matter of economy, which ends up also then becoming interpretive in the way certain playwrights and plays might choose to use it, and trying to trigger kind of thematic connections between two characters who might otherwise be separate. Is that right?
And very often you will see um, thematic links. And I mean, the Cordelia one and Cordelia and the Fool is really attractive because when Cordelia dies, Lear says, "Alas, my fool is dead," and it's often read as a moment where that thematic connection between two characters who are a crutch to Lear are brought together in that line of dialogue. And as I say, I'm not persuaded by the possibilities of that one, although I love the thematic potential of it.
Can you tell us why you're not persuaded?
Just because there doesn't seem to be enough time for. So one of the rules that we sort of established for casting possibilities was that if somebody leaves the stage, they can't immediately re-enter as someone else. Purely, for practicalities. If you're wearing a costume, you've got to change costume, but also it's a disorienting thing unless it's very overtly done, in which case I've seen it done and it works great. But it could be a disorienting thing if we're looking for verisimilitude for Cordelia to walk off as herself and then return in slapstick. There are cases where I sort of established that it looks like 40 lines is enough to switch character. So where it sort of comes up is where this came in was that it looked like I think it was Two Noble Kinsmen where it first occurred to me, but it looks like if you don't allow characters the possibility of doubling after a 40-line gap, then suddenly your numbers for casting, the number of actors that you need to perform a play, could suddenly go through the roof, where if you allow the 40, the principle of economy allows you to sort of do the play with less actors. And several times in doing those casting lists and imagining the doubling possibilities, 40 lines came up as a conspicuous number. So that it did look like it might be a deciding factor in a play, or it might have been what they decided was the amount of time it takes to change a costume or not disorient your audience when you come back as someone else.
Right. Yeah, it's becoming a recurring theme in these videos. We've had a number of conversations now around text and performance, and the issue of time, which is very difficult to read on the page. But becomes incredibly obvious the moment you try and actually do something. And I love that idea of trying to pinpoint by a number of line how much time something might take place. I rudely interrupted you though. You were telling us about your work more broadly, and I immediately seized on the first thing you mentioned. But would you mind continuing telling us? You've mentioned theatre history, actors in Shakespeare's plays, and the New Oxford Shakespeare.
Yeah. So. As I say, I'm doing that same role for the Oxford Marlowe as well. But that work has also found expression in two chapters that I have contributed to works that I edited with Rory Lochman, late Shakespeare, 1608 to 1613.
Mm-hmm.
Am I remembering the numbers right? That one's a while ago.
I'll concede to you on that one.
Just this week, just yesterday, I received a copy of, I'm going to show it to you just to product place, Early Shakespeare, 1588 to 1594. So my chapters in these are based on the ages of actors. And so for the late Shakespeare book, I did a chapter on aging actors and how the relationships between protagonists and their counterparts, or those characters that they work most closely with in the drama, changes significantly for the later plays. My suggestion there is that an aging Richard Burbage looks less comfortable as a romantic pairing to a boy actor than he does as a paternal figure. So that's the sort of basic argument of that, is that an aging Burbage, who is Shakespeare's main actor for most of his career, is gonna look odd in romantic roles at that stage. Or I mean, there are still some, but so that a thematic shift goes on in Shakespeare's work to get the most out of his best actor, and so turns to sort of paternal relationships rather than romantic ones.
Yeah, which brings us back to the issue of text and time again. A very different kind of time, but how text, as text is being composed, how it responds to the aging body of the actor. That's really interesting. And then early Shakespeare.
Yeah. Early Shakespeare, I just sort of flipped it upside down, and instead of looking at aging main actors, I looked at developing young actors. So my sort of basic question is, how do you get to be Juliet? How do you become good enough to do a part as big as Juliet? And so through the early plays, I traced a set of graduated roles that a boy actor might play, from a sort of silent walk-on part to a spoken part off stage, to a 40-line speech on your own but more or less nothing else, all the way up to a fully integrated romantic pairing. So that was my sort of process. There was to look at the boys as I had looked at the aging Richard Burbage in the later later Shakespeare, and then we looked at the boys developing. How do they grow up? What's the beginning of an actor's career like?
Yeah. And that last point brings me on to the question I was going to ask you next, which is, both as contributing writer but also as editor, how did it feel to do that slightly George Lucas Star Wars thing of doing late Shakespeare and then going back and doing a prequel in the form of early Shakespeare? And will you at some point be doing a book which is like just on time Shakespeare, neither early nor late? Yeah, what was the experience, and what did you learn from thinking about late and then moving back to early? That's the sensible version of that question.
Yeah, it feels like it was always part of our plan to go back and do early. So I'm not entirely sure where it first came up. I think when we started preparing late Shakespeare, we had no idea how well it would be received, first by Sarah Stanton at Cambridge University Press, who we were surprised initially was interested in two very young and naive Irish academics, and then how well we would do at gathering, I mean, names that are sort of that left me starstruck at the time. You know, guys like Michael Neal and Andrew Hiscock, and yet we got a fantastic group of scholars to agree to join that project. Grace Iopolo, Sandra Clark. So that the success of that commissioning process, I suppose, initially the pitch to Sarah Stanton, who was great and really supportive, and then the sort of warmth with which it was received by the scholars that we were inviting to be part of it, gave us the nerve to threaten a prequel.
And as a theatre historian, what does it feel like to jump between these two quite carefully demarcated chunks of time? What are they? 5 years? Just over 5 year periods? 5 to 8 years, maybe 1608 to 1613, and then to kind of do, get into a TARDIS and go back to 1588 to 1594. Were there particular challenges, opportunities, approaches that those two time periods invite?
Yeah, well, so in a way, they both deal with the same issue for us, which is prevailing narratives that both ends seem always to be read from the middle, so that late Shakespeare is seen as a sort of natural consequence of what went before. And of course it is in many ways, but it is also the product of what is happening in those specific years. It's not just that Shakespeare's greatness has been discovered and is now recognized, and now he can relax and do something else a little bit cooler with his language, or that he senses death approaching and can say goodbye in the proper way. Rather, it's another set of 5 years when theater circumstances change. They get the Blackfriars, they get the license, so they can suddenly move indoors at the winter. Several of the colleagues that he is working with as actors die over a sort of 2 or 3 year period. You've got deaths and retirements of actors who have been with him since the beginning. And so there are circumstances that change what's happening for the theater company, what goes on in terms of competition, so that just looking at it as Shakespeare going off to do romance now, when the end of his career comes, they're not quite right. Other things are changing. He's responding to the popularity of Beaumont and Fletcher. He's going to work with Fletcher, and so that book was a sort of a way of resituating those plays in a different sort of narrative, thinking about them as their own set, not just as part of the end of Shakespeare's life. For me, thinking about them as part of the end of Burbage's life was a nice way to just sort of shift the angle. But also we brought in the histories, that is Henry VIII, and we brought in the Roman plays and set them side by side, and we asked our context contributors to deal with the plays not just as sets of romances and then other outliers and collaborations, but try to put them all together and work with them all in conjunction. And so early Shakespeare is a sort of natural other to that. It's the phase in Shakespeare's life where we're thinking of his work as novice, as not quite ready, but he's getting there. And some of that must be true. He must be developing, but those 7 years need to be looked at, or those 5 years, 7 plays. I'm not even sure if we identified 7 distinct plays, but that those works deserve to be looked at for themselves and as a group as well, rather than just as precursors to the middle great phase. So on one level, will we do a sequel to the prequel? It's not necessary, because the whole point in the beginning was that we were trying to sort of destabilize this a dominant narrative that sets the central works as the great works, and those things either side of them as flawed or just as leading to those middle great works. But there are shifts in historical context there that may be worth looking at. And so the late Shakespeare book, for me, on a lot of levels, thinking of actors, was not just work that began in 1608. In order to trace the age of aging actors, I had to look back at the beginning. So it wasn't a huge shift for me to go back to Shakespeare's beginnings in the theatre, and to think of the formation of the Chamberlain's Men as a significant moment when he is certainly from there on working with a very stable group of actors up until 1608, when some of them die, and then leave him with Richard Burbage probably as the old man of the theatre, and Hemmings and Condell. So I was already thinking about that beginning marker when I was writing my 1608 to 1613 piece. And there is a middle story to tell, right? You can't write the early part of an actor's career and the late part of an actor's career, just leave it. I want to know what happens in the middle as well. So even if we don't do middle Shakespeare 1595 to you know what I'm getting at. Even if we don't do that, I will have to. There is a part of me that will have to return to the actors in that stage, and to think about what the middle phase for an actor's career is. But the partnership with Rory works very well. So certainly wouldn't say no to working with him again.
Brilliant, thank you. I particularly love the idea of challenging prevailing narratives in which the kind of peripheral ends of someone's career get read via the middle. Part of me is wondering if that's a specifically Shakespearean issue or not. I'm trying to think of the ways other writers get read. I keep seeing the phrase at the moment, early Marlowe and late Marlowe, and I keep wondering if you can really have early and late in such a short period of playwriting, for example, and particularly a period of playwriting where it's quite hard to pin down where the plays fall in that career. But it does feel like perhaps a specifically Shakespearean issue that his career does fall into 3/3, and we think of 2 of the thirds via one of them.
Yeah, I mean, it must be a consequence of him having written for so long. He was enormously productive for a very long time compared to his peers. So that must be a part of it. Also, the sheer industry of Shakespeare has to be a part of it. I mean, he's as much myth as he is textual reality. He's in the cultural imagination, and probably in the cultural imagination in a way that is just not really true anymore. So it is always interesting, I think, to return to that imaginary Shakespeare, tortured solo author, you know, mopping sweat from his brow as he composes some great solo line. Not undoubtedly, he did sit on his own sometimes and write great lines, but for me at least, he is only ever doing so very rarely without thinking of someone else. I mean, the sonnets, the 2 narrative poems, the 2 longer narrative poems, the rest of the time he's writing for actors, writing for a theater company, writing for a theater audience. Even when he's writing his longer narrative poems, he's thinking about how much money he might get offered for them, or, you know, there is a material world out there that you can't just pull a solitary soul out of. I think this sort of social isolation thing may sort of maybe we're thinking about it in this regard. Nobody locks themselves up voluntarily and has no contact with the rest of the world, no matter how tortured a creative genius they are. I think that sort of, we're sort of haunted by that bizarre narrative of Shakespeare as a man.
Yeah.
I think the length of his career also means that we have chunks to sort of separate out and say, this is what he's doing here, even if we have a handful of plays that don't fit into that, or a handful of poems that don't fit into that thing.
Yeah, thank you. If it's right to play a bit with the idea of the length of his career, I wonder if I can think of other writers who have careers which are as long or possibly even longer. And I wonder if what's distinctive is that he happens to have a long career either side of the century divide, and he has a sort of 10 to 15 year Elizabethan career and a 10 to 15 year Jacobean career, and also that his career gets well reflected by print culture in the form of the folio. So I suppose I'm thinking there about people like Johnson or Middleton who may have had longer careers. Anthony Munday, who I think we always think of as not very prolific at all until we check, and then we're all completely horrified because he spends 50 years writing these mammoth texts. But is it something about having that particular career at that particular moment and the way it gets mediated in print, perhaps?
Yeah, and I guess sort of success within the theatre and success with patronage can't have done any harm. To have been a king's man for so long must have an effect on at least your sort of immediate cultural imprint.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, the size of the Beaumont and Fletcher canon, although it sort of fragments, the size of Middleton's canon, certainly volume of production is not the answer. The answer, I think, is something more sort of culturally curious.
Yeah, and the mediation of that production. Andrew, if it's all right, I keep interrupting you as you're telling us about your overall work. So we're doing a very bad job of getting through your mammoth research profile, but I want to make sure we talk about your own book, which I know is on its way out. So maybe can I ask you to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So there is a monograph that is on Seneca, really. It's about madness. Let me give you the title. That might clear up some of it. It might not. It's called Stages of Madness, Sin, Sickness, and Seneca. Wow. In Shakespearean drama. And it's contracted to Peter Lang. It's finished, but it needs a little tidy.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It began as my doctoral thesis a very, very long time ago and is absolutely nothing like my doctoral thesis anymore. But what it does is it looks at 3 different ways of imagining madness that were sort of popular in the early modern period and that impacted Shakespeare's and his contemporaries' construction of madness on the stage. And those things are a sort of moral standpoint that views madness as a consequence of sin or as sin itself. Sickness is the middle portion, and it deals with more medically scientific understandings of the brain and the mind, of the interrelationship between the body and the soul. So lots of that section deals with melancholy theory, and some good work on that. And then the final portion is Seneca. And what the Seneca section does is it looks at Senecan influences on Shakespeare's construction of stage madmen. Hamlet is the really obvious Senecan revenger madman. He is mad at all. The book doesn't answer that. And it looks at the history within England of the use of Senecan models within English theatre, so going back to the 1560s, the spate of translations by people. that were gathered together in this 1581 Seneca, his 10 tragedies.
Yeah.
And also at plays, early Inns of Court plays like Tancred and Gismond, Gorboduc, what else? Jocasta, as representing madness in a particularly Senecan way. The argument of the book is that in order to get to an understanding of a character like Hamlet, Shakespeare's mad characters, and his contemporaries too, you can't just look at melancholy, you can't just look at the moral implications of sin, but you have to look also at Seneca. And of course, you can't just get there by understanding Seneca. What it takes in order to understand the stage madmen, the period, is a composite understanding of a range of different sources. So on some levels, it's simple source studies, but what it urges is an intricate and a complicated understanding of how sources combine together on the stage.
Yeah. While you're talking, just so we can give them a shout out, I think it's Thomas Newton that we're thinking of as the translator of Seneca. And that 15...
a set of his first name is lost to me. Buchanan is one of the other translators. He does Agamemnon, and Thyestes is translated by, I'm hoping that saying it will bring in Jasper Heywood. Jasper Heywood was the one that stuck me and made me incapable of getting to the rest of them. Newton is the one who gathers the collection of Seneca, his 10 tragedies.
Great. This is how I teach my students and supervise PhD students. I'm constantly saying, you must read this book with a title of some kind, and it's by someone with a name. That 1581 edition as well, we've been talking about how Shakespeare gets mediated in print. I think that 1581 Seneca is hugely important for thinking about plays in print in this period. And some of our colleagues have asked the question of how a playwright like Shakespeare might have thought about plays as a kind of non-print phenomenon, and not thinking of them as something that might go into print. But you have people like Seneca being published in 81, absolutely showing the way in terms of plays in print. So you talked about sources then. Are you able to give us an example of how you think Shakespeare was using Seneca? Just to help us think about what you mean by source.
Yeah, so I should have prepared a little handout.
Don't worry if you can't.
If you think about Lady Macbeth's invocation of night, come thick night and hold thee in the dun of smoke of hell.
Yeah.
That invocation has a sort of very clear lineage to Medea in Seneca's play. But it's not simply Medea. What Medea is one in a pattern of female mad characters who seek revenge. So she's slightly unusual in her placing in Macbeth, because she has nothing to avenge. She's not avenging herself against Jason. She's not avenging herself against, for instance, Agamemnon. Clytemnestra would be another one who fits in the pattern. So there is this pattern that in Seneca very often becomes a set speech. The distressed lady seeking revenge unfurls her hair and wails and beats her breast and scratches at herself with her nails and says some line about hell or the spirits of the underworld or the Furies, invoking them to give her the strength to commit whatever revenge she wants.
Yeah.
Lady Macbeth says, "Unsex me here." That sort of vocalizes what in Seneca is a symbolic scratching away of the breast. So when Lady Macbeth talks about dashing the brains out of her child who had nursed at her dug, what she's doing there is vocalizing something in quite nice new language that is a visual part of what the Senecan sources do. So it's not a simply grabbing a speech from Medea and going, here, I can reuse this here in Macbeth, a Scottish play about something else. It's a question of using a set of patterns, a set of traditions to evoke the spirit of something, and then knitting some nice new language around it. But the trace of the original is still there in a line here and a line there. And then there are other sort of nicer or more intricate patterns that also get evoked. And the book traces that through a whole set of female characters in the Inns of Court plays as well, and up to Medea. Medea does get a good look in. I was just with my students before I came on here in a short story class. We were doing Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, and as he talks about cleaning up the blood, he says, "There, not a spot." And it obviously it reminded me of Lady Macbeth's "Out Damn Spot," that cleansing ritual that replaces the unfurling of the hair. But there's another instance of Macbeth or Lady Macbeth becoming source, having used the source.
Yeah, thank you. From worries about your hairdo to worries about spots, it feels like kind of teenage regression, and many of us are there during lockdown, I feel. Andrew, is there anything I should ask you further? Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your work before we wrap up the film?
There is one other book that is coming out this year. It's been quite a fun project. What it is the birth and death of the reader. No, it's not. It's the birth and death of the author. A multi-authored history of print authorship. It's a multi-authored history of print authorship because what it does is I write this long introduction that covers authorship from as early as I can find a text to read up until the printing press, and then a series of fabulous authors, co-authors, take 1 century each from the invention of the printing press and do a case study up until the 21st century, and we do comic books in the 21st century. Derek Green does that. Andy Galloway does the section on Chaucer, Hockleaf, and Lydgate, right at the sort of transition from manuscript to print. Our old friend Rory Loughnane, who collaborated with me on the editing of Late Shakespeare and Early Shakespeare, does a brilliant chapter on Marlowe and Shakespeare on collaboration. Adele Semple does a wonderful chapter on John Taylor, the water poet. William Engel does an amazing chapter on Herman Melville, and Brad Tuggle does a chapter on James Joyce. And we cover all sorts of different angles of authorship and of the interrelationship between material and authorship. What material affects the production of authorship can have on the attempt to theorize the death of the author, as Barth does. And once we think about the materials of authorly production, how does that affect our theoretical desire to set the reader free and dismiss the author?
Great, thank you. And presumably those material effects will also have impacted on the authors themselves and how they think about an action they're writing.
Right, so that if I'm no longer writing my great work on my own, secluded away with a quill. Um, but if I'm working on a typewriter, if I'm working on a laptop, how does my methods of writing affect what it is that I write? How does my relationship with the text affect how the reader's relationship with the text is going to be, or the reader's expectations of the author in the text?
Yeah.
And any material shifts in how an author constructs a text must affect how a reader engages with the text too.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And possibly vice versa as well, in terms of your expectations of how your work will be consumed, which I guess varies from writing a play in the 16th century with collaboratively to Joyce in Paris thinking, how the hell do I get, will I publish these texts, where and who will allow me to do it? Yeah, it affects both ends of that relationship, both author and consumer, I guess.
Yeah, and the sort of one of the sort of material ideas of the book is to work from tablet to tablet. That if authorship begins on a tablet, on a clay tablet in and ends, I'm currently talking to you on my tablet. So that sort of the vast shifts that occur in technology of writing and reading are really important to how we understand what it is that has been written.
Yeah, I'm so excited to read that book. That sounds completely wonderful, and I look forward to hearing more.
I must mention the chat. As soon as I gave everyone else a mention, Natasha Richardson's chapter on Samuel Richardson is spectacular, and it is in a way about fan fiction, but of the 18th century.
Great. When that book's out, if you or any contributor wants to come on and talk to us, please do. We've got a series of films now coming out about authorship, and soon coming out. Megan Cook and Sarah Werner thinking about Geoffrey Chaucer as a 16th century author, his emergence as a kind of great author in the 16th century. So yeah, if you or any of your contributors want to come and join us, we'd love to hear more. Andrew, it's been a total joy. I forgot to warn you that we finish these videos. I'm going to ask this question very slowly so you have lots of thinking time. We finish these videos by asking whether the word literature is a useful word to you, either personally or professionally, if it's a word which sits in your lexicon, if it feels like a useful word, or a word that gets in your way. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about where you sit with that word, or where it sits with you?
Literature. So literature must be sort of vast and capacious. For me, as a sort of materialist, am I a materialist? As someone interested in materials and the materials of production, if you think about that in terms of my sort of material authorship book and the sort of material context of authorship for the theatre, then the materiality, the material of literature, or literature will always be thought of as material to me. And I think it also must be, I don't want to evoke Raymond Williams, I am going to evoke Raymond Williams, but literature is ordinary as well, that literature is everywhere and anything. I think your weird question got a weird answer.
It was a weird question, but it wasn't a weird answer. I think that's fantastic. And we've thought so much across this film about things you might do with literature, from counting props, counting objects within a piece of literature, to using it to diagnose the potential age of actors, or to think about how that age impacts on the literature, about how to challenge prevailing narratives and seeing different ends of a career in their own terms rather than from the center of that career. Thinking about saucy Seneca and where he sits in Shakespeare's brain, and finally thinking about where authorship sits in relation to the longest literary history I think I've ever heard. I can't wait to read that book and get taken from tablet to tablet, as you put it. That's wonderful. Andrew, thank you very much. It's been a real joy.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Take care.